In the last week of the Second World War, American and German soldiers fought a battle on the same side, to save 350 horses. On the 26th of April, 1945, an American cavalry outpost on the Czech border took in a German officer who had crossed the lines to surrender. That was routine by then. Senior Germans were surrendering in numbers. What was not routine was what he wanted to talk about. He had a set of aerial photographs with him, and he laid them on the table and started talking about horses. 8 miles inside German-held territory, he said, at a place called Hostau, there was a stud farm. On it were the breeding mares of the Spanish riding school of Vienna, the Lipizzaners, a bloodline 400 years old, along with hundreds of other captured horses, several hundred Allied prisoners of war, and a garrison of German veterinarians and grooms who had no intention of fighting anybody. The Red Army was about 40 miles east and closing. And he wanted the Americans to come and take all of it. What the Americans decided to do about that request is one of the strangest orders ever issued by the United States Army, a cavalry raid, 8 miles behind enemy lines, in the last fortnight of the war, mounted jointly with the German garrison it was supposed to be attacking. And 2 days later they were shooting, alongside each other, at Waffen-SS troops who had come to stop them. The unit that got the call was the 2nd Cavalry Group under Colonel Charles Hancock Reed, and the coincidence is almost too neat. The 2nd Cavalry had been a horse regiment for a century, and Reed himself was a horseman, a competitive rider from the days when American cavalry officers were selected partly on how well they rode. By 1945 the horses were long gone, the regiment fought in armored cars and jeeps. Its commander still knew exactly what he was being offered. Reed had something else that mattered more than sentiment: reconnaissance units. A cavalry group in 1945 existed to find out what was in front of the army, which meant that of all the formations on that part of the front, his was the one built to send small parties deep into unclear territory and bring them back. If the request had landed on an infantry division, it would very likely have died in an intray. To understand why anyone cared, you have to know what was standing in those stables. The Lipizzaner is not just a white horse. The line was founded in 1580, bred for the imperial court in Vienna, and by 1945 it existed as a closed genetic population of a few hundred animals. The mares were the bloodline, and if the mares were lost, for centuries of breeding ended. This is a Lipizzaner of the Spanish riding school today. The reason you can still see one is what happened in the last week of April 1945. A word about why the mares matter more than the famous white stallions, because it is the hinge of the whole story. The stallions people pay to watch in Vienna are the performers, spectacular, valuable, and replaceable in the sense that any stallion can be replaced by another stallion. The mares are the archive. 400 years of selective breeding lives in the female line, and a closed population of a few hundred animals cannot absorb the loss of its breeding stock. Kill the mares and the Lipizzaner does not decline. It stops. The war had scattered them. As Vienna came under air attack, the school's director, Colonel Alois Podhajski, had moved the performing stallions west to a village in Upper Austria. But the mares, the breeding stock, the part that actually matters if you want a bloodline to continue, had been taken east by the German army years earlier, to a requisitioned stud farm in the Sudetenland. That farm was Hostau, and Hostau was about to end up between two armies. Find it on the map and the problem becomes obvious. Hostau sits in the borderland between Bavaria and Bohemia, in what is now the Czech Republic. In the last week of April 1945, the American Third Army was pushing east into this pocket, the Red Army was pushing west toward it, and the line between them was closing like a pair of jaws. Whichever army arrived first would decide what happened to everything inside. And here is the part that made the Germans at Hostau desperate enough to invite an enemy in. The Soviet army in the spring of 1945 was moving fast, living off the country, and hungry. Horses in the path of that advance were, in the most literal sense, meat. The men at Horsemen had watched it happen elsewhere. They knew that an irreplaceable 400-year-old bloodline meant nothing to a supply sergeant with troops to feed. They also had no way to move 600 animals west on their own. The man who carried the offer across the lines was a Luftwaffe intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Holters. He was not a horseman and he had nothing personally at stake in the stud farm. He had come across mainly because he wanted to surrender to the Americans rather than the Russians. But he knew about Horsemen, and he understood that the horses were a card worth playing. At Horsemen itself, the officer in command of the veterinary establishment was Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Radowski, a professional horse breeder in uniform, from a Sudeten German family, running a farm full of animals he had spent his career caring for. He wanted them out, west, alive. And to get that he was willing to hand the farm to an army he was technically still at war with, which under German law in April 1945 was desertion at best. Between the two of them and the Americans went a German veterinarian who could speak for the farm, and an American officer who volunteered to ride in and negotiate it, Captain Thomas Stewart, who went through the German lines under a flag of truce to reach Horsemen and came back out again with an agreement. Read that sentence again. An American officer walked into a German-held village in the last week of the war, negotiated with the garrison, and walked out with a deal to take the place jointly. Think about the position Stewart was in. He was walking into a village garrisoned by an enemy who, 40 miles east of him, was still executing his own soldiers for trying to surrender. He had no way of knowing whether the officers who had sent for him controlled the place, or whether an SS detachment had arrived that morning. If the invitation was a trap, or simply out of date, nobody on the American side would have known where to look for him. Colonel Reed took the plan up the chain, and it reached the one American general guaranteed to say yes. George Patton was a cavalryman. He had ridden for the United States at the 1912 Olympics, in the modern pentathlon, and he had spent his career in and around horses. Presented with a scheme to ride behind enemy lines and rescue the Spanish riding school's bloodline, Patton did not agonize. He approved it and told Reed to put a task force together fast. There was also a clock on it that had nothing to do with either army's plans. Several of the mares at Horsemen were within days of foaling. A pregnant mare cannot be marched hard, and a mare that foals on a road in a combat zone will usually lose the foal and often herself. Every day the negotiation took was a day closer to the point where moving the animals at all became impossible, and the Red Army was not going to wait for the veterinary calendar. The force that went in on the 28th of April was small and strange. A troop of American cavalry in armored cars and jeeps, with light tanks in support, and riding with them, as guides and liaison, German officers from the farm. Their orders, if you strip away the diplomatic language, were to drive 8 miles into territory still nominally held by the German army, and take possession of a stud farm with the cooperation of its garrison. On the way in they were shot at. Not by the garrison they were going to meet, by other Germans who had not been told and would not have agreed, a Wehrmacht unit at a roadblock, and then, more seriously, Waffen-SS infantry. Because that is the thing about the last fortnight of that war, there was no single German army anymore. There were units that wanted it over and units that intended to keep killing until somebody stopped them. So the Americans and the Horsemen Germans ended up fighting the same enemy in the same action. The task force beat off 2 SS attacks on the farm over the following days, with the German garrison, veterinarians, grooms, cavalry instructors, holding parts of the perimeter alongside American troopers. Nobody involved seems to have found this remarkable at the time. They had a deadline and a job. What they found inside was more than horses. Horsemen held several hundred Allied prisoners of war, British, New Zealanders, French, Poles and Serbs, some of them cavalrymen who had been put to work with the animals. This photograph shows Allied prisoners at another camp greeting an American cavalry reconnaissance unit that same month, multiply the relief on those faces by a farm full of men who had assumed the Russians would arrive first. It is worth saying plainly what those prisoners had been doing there, because it explains why the handover worked as smoothly as it did. Allied POWs with any horse experience had been put to work in the stables, feeding, mucking out, exercising the animals, in some cases for years. By April 1945 the farm was being run by a mixed workforce of German staff and enemy prisoners who had spent long enough together caring for the same horses that the categories had worn thin. When the Americans arrived, there was no dramatic liberation seen at the stables. There was a shift change. Then came the problem nobody had really solved: how do you move 600 horses, including heavily pregnant mares and foals, 40 miles west across a collapsing front, in a fortnight when everything with an engine is either broken or needed somewhere else? The answer was the oldest one available. You ride them, and you walk them. So the last mounted operation in the history of the United States cavalry was conducted by American troopers, German grooms and liberated Allied prisoners, moving in column across the Bohemian border country, in relays, over several days. Mares in foal were led. Stallions were ridden by whoever could ride. Some animals went in trucks when trucks could be found. The column was mixed in every possible sense: American, German, British, Polish, and several hundred horses that did not know there had been a war. There is a detail about the march that says more about the last week of that war than any casualty figure. The column had to be fed. 600 horses eat an enormous quantity of hay and grain a day, and the countryside they were crossing had been stripped by 2 armies. So American supply officers, German grooms and Polish ex-prisoners spent those days doing the same thing together, finding fodder, negotiating with farmers, loading wagons. The war was still legally on. The paperwork had simply stopped mattering. They were shot at again on the way. The route ran through country where SS units were still active, and the column was strafed at one point and ambushed at another. They lost animals. But the essential thing, the mares, the Lipizzaner breeding stock, the 4 centuries, came across into American-held territory intact, along with the prisoners and the German garrison, who by then had surrendered formally to the men they had spent 3 days fighting beside. The village itself is still there, and this is what it looks like today: an ordinary small town in the Czech Republic called Hostown, with an ordinary main street, where in the last week of April 1945 2 enemy armies briefly agreed to a ceasefire in order to save a bloodline of horses from a third one. Colonel Podhajski, the director of the Spanish riding school, staged one of the most effective performances of his career a few days later. With the stallions safe in Upper Austria but the school's future entirely undecided, he put on a full demonstration for Patton, the airs above the ground, the whole classical repertoire, and then asked him formally to take the school under American protection. Patton did. The horses became, briefly and officially, wards of the United States Army. The horses were not the only thing that came out of Hostow, and the rest of it is worth counting. Several hundred Allied prisoners went west instead of east, which in the spring of 1945 was not a trivial distinction, since Allied POWs liberated by the Red Army often spent months in Soviet hands before repatriation. The German garrison surrendered intact to the Americans rather than being overrun. And a stud farm that would almost certainly have been stripped for meat was handed over as a working establishment. It is worth being honest about the arithmetic here, because this is a story that invites sentimentality. In the last 2 weeks of the European war, tens of thousands of people were still dying, and millions of displaced civilians were walking the roads of Central Europe with nothing. A cavalry operation to save horses is a small thing measured against that, and some of the men involved said so afterwards. What they also said, in various ways, was that it was one of the only things they did in 1945 that felt uncomplicated. There was no target to destroy and nobody to kill in order to succeed. Two groups of men who had been trying to kill each other for years found one objective they could both agree on, and for about 72 hours the war stopped mattering more than the job. The bloodline survived. The Lipizzaner Mares went back to Austria, the Spanish riding school reopened, and the line that was founded in 1580 is still being bred today, which means that every Lipizzaner alive is descended from animals that were walked out of Hostau in April 1945 by an American cavalry unit, a German veterinary garrison, and a few hundred freed prisoners of war, while the Waffen-SS shot at them. Colonel Reed kept in touch with the Germans he had raided for the rest of his life. Hubert Radowski, who had handed over the farm, was expelled from Czechoslovakia with the rest of the Sudeten German population after the war and died in Bavaria, largely unrecognized for what he had done. In 1963 Disney made a film about the operation and got most of it wrong, which is roughly the fate this story deserved and did not deserve at the same time. So here is the question this one leaves. Nothing about Operation Cowboy was strategically necessary. It rescued no cities, shortened no war, and saved no soldiers' lives. It saved horses, and a few hundred prisoners who would probably have been liberated within weeks anyway. And yet everyone who took part in it, on both sides, seems to have regarded it as the best thing they did in the entire war. Was it worth risking men for? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe. Every battle comes down to one moment. The last salvo.